English Grammar and Use has been going for 30 years, so I've had a lot of opportunity to make any changes I've wanted to make, which is very nice for an author. I wrote the book as a self-study book for learners of English from anywhere in the world. I wrote for adults and I wrote it for self-study, a book that people could use on their own outside a classroom. If they didn't get the information they wanted or the practice they wanted in the class, about grammar I mean, then they had this other source of information, because students asked continually for grammar books, which is fair enough. A grammar book and a dictionary, they're essential reference tools. Yeah, there's been lots of changes, mainly small changes and also additions, but the essence of the book is the same, and the way it works is the same. It's easy to use, it's clear what you have to do. You've got the information on one page and the exercises on the facing page. And it's written for students to use. That means writing in language which is unnaturally simple, but simple. Getting rid of the words, too many words, not being wordy, and avoiding grammatical terminology, because you don't need grammatical terminology. Grammar and language, they're not academic things. We don't need that. I like to present the language. This is how it is. This is how it works. Here are some examples. Now you have a go. That's what it is. I don't need to cloud that in lots of mystery. So I think that's how it is, the same as it was. I hope so anyway. The essential content is the same. So really we're talking more about details. On the left-hand pages, I've tried to improve the wording of explanations. On the right-hand pages, the exercises, I've tried to improve the exercises, make them more appropriate to the task. So there are lots of changes on that scale. But in addition to that, there are whole new sections added to the book, additional exercises. They are exercises which cover more than one unit. Also a study guide, which is a kind of diagnostic test. So if a user wants to get some idea of what would be useful for him or for her to study, then they can use this multiple choice diagnostic test, which we call a study guide. The look of the book has changed as well. So originally, of course, it was black and white, and then there was one colour, or two colour rather, and then full colour printing, and the general design of the book has been changed, and the art has been changed, that sort of thing. And finally, the book is being updated. Now that covers quite a lot of things, but in particular, sentences like I must go to the bank to get some money. That doesn't sound quite right these days. You'd be more inclined to just say, I'm going to get some money, get some money out of an ATM or a cash machine. But you wouldn't normally talk about going to the bank to get some money. You still go to the bank, and you can get money in the bank, but normally you go to the bank to do more complicated things. It's not a routine thing as it was in, say, 1970, 1980. Developing photographs, somebody says, oh, can I see your holiday photographs? And you say, well, yeah, I'll show them to you, but I haven't had the film developed yet. So that wouldn't ring true. People would, strange. It also works the other way. There are things you can say now which you couldn't have said 30 years ago. So you might say, I've lost my phone. If you said that 30 years ago, I've lost my phone, that would be a rather strange thing to say. It's a bit like saying I lost my fridge, or a phone is not something you can lose. In the course of the history of the book, Standard English has changed. I should clarify that. It's my perception of Standard English, because there isn't any one perception of Standard English. We have this sort of very vague idea of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable in Standard English. Not a question of right or wrong, it's a question of what is appropriate in that particular version of English. So things have changed in the lifetime of the book, and I have changed the book accordingly. So a few things that I didn't have in the original editions are now in the current editions. Shortly after the British editions were published, Cambridge University Press decided to publish an American English version. It's not that American and British grammar is very different, because it isn't. I should emphasise here I'm talking about standard British English and standard American English. So if you compare those two, there are very, very few differences in grammar. Most of them are quite small and they're not complete. So things which maybe an American would say more than a British person would say, but they still work in both forms of the language. There are a few things like in British English we use shall I and shall we. I think that's unusual in American to use shall in those situations. Needn't, you needn't do something. Americans find a bit strange, a bit odd, unusual. Also smaller things, specific things, like in British English we'd say he's ill, he's in hospital. In American English it would be he's in the hospital, even though you may not be thinking about a particular hospital. Whereas in British English, in that situation, he's in hospital. And there are lots of other smaller differences like that. But that really wasn't the reason to have an American edition, not the main reason. The main reason is because the main differences between British and American English are to do with vocabulary, with idiom, with style. And an American reading my British text would find it very British. And an American, someone who wanted to learn American English might be disappointed that they were getting British English. I should say also, of course, that I didn't do this personally. We had an American adapter, Will Smolzer, and he adapted, he went through the text and changed all the things that needed changing. So shop became store. Anything that sounded British was changed to something that sounded American. And then I read through that and we worked together to make sure that we produced a version that we both found was right. And that's how the American editions were produced. There are two types of bilingual versions. There are adaptations where the content actually changes. There are simple translations where it's just translated. So everything's the same except certain bits are in a different language. The adaptations are mainly for essential grammar and use, the lower level. And in the adaptations, the content changes. So maybe some units are not the same in the international edition as they are in say, the Italian edition or the German edition or the French edition. So certain changes were made in accordance with the needs of people from that particular language group. So if you're writing a book for international learners, for example, in my books there is a unit comparing and the indefinite articles, a car and the car. If your first language doesn't have articles, then that's a valid thing to do. But if your first language is German or French, for example, most Western European languages anyway, you already have this difference between a definite and indefinite article. You've already learnt that difference. Of course, they don't work in 100% the same way, but the basic difference between and the, you don't have to teach that to a German-speaking learner or a French-speaking learner. Whereas someone who's Japanese or who's Turkish or who's Russian, that's a different story. So that unit, and the, you won't find in the Italian edition, but you will find other things which are not in the international edition. The others are translations. The first translation, any translated edition, was Icelandic. Very soon after the first book was published, it was for schools. The book was adopted in schools in Iceland and they wanted a translated version. Translations are useful for learners because it's quite hard reading a book, a grammar reference book, in the language that you're actually learning. It's quite a challenge. I've got German grammars and French grammars at home, but they're in English and they're written for speakers of English. With the higher level book, English Grammar and Use, I think that's okay for most learners. They manage because it's written quite simply. And Essential Grammar and Use, the lower level, although it's written in a very simple style and there are not too many words on the page, it's still quite a challenge. I find it a challenge if I'm learning Turkish or something and I have to read a text in Turkish. Oh, that's hard. So if a student can do it, that's great because it's another experience of using the language you're learning. But if you can't or you want to focus on the task of learning the language or learning about the grammar in this case, it's a good idea to have translated versions. E-books are being produced at the moment and will be out pretty soon. E-books have the advantage, people who want to work using a screen rather than paper, using a screen in their finger or mouse or whatever rather than a pen and paper, it's good to have this alternative presentation. but the ebook content is the same as in the book. An important advantage of the ebook is it has audio, which of course the book itself doesn't have. So it means that somebody using the book by themselves can now hear all the examples. That's a big plus. We produced a mobile app for English grammar and use. I think it was a year or two ago. This is distinct from the ebook. The ebook is just a screen version, a digital version of the print book. The mobile app, which is for English grammar and use, not essential grammar use, but English grammar and use, is rather different because the mobile app was written particularly for phones and iPads, but I was thinking particularly of phones, which means a very small screen. So using a very, very small screen is going to be a bit different from using two fairly large pages. In the book, you have a left-hand page and a right-hand page. The left-hand page has information and the right-hand page has exercises. So you look at the left-hand page, you study the left-hand page as much as you want, and then you move to the right-hand page for exercises, and you can go back and forth if you wish. With the app, on a small screen, on a phone screen, you can't really do that. You can't get the content of the left-hand page, if you like, on one screen. So it's divided up into smaller chunks, and after each small chunk you're taken to an exercise. Then you go back to the second chunk and then to another exercise, or maybe two exercises, building up gradually to the end of the unit. Also, the exercises have been significantly changed in order to fit the limitations of a digital product, one that can be easily checked. So you can't have lots of exercises which are open-ended because there's no clear way of checking it. You can't say right or wrong. There are too many possibilities. And also, if you have a lot of typing, then people are going to make typing errors, and you have that problem to contend with as well. So it's better to have exercises which are more closed, where there are a very limited number of right or wrong possibilities. Those are the main differences. The app, of course, like the ebook, has audio, which is again a huge benefit. It has the same function. It's for use as self-study, for people to use by themselves, to select what they want to study. That's exactly the same as in the book. I like to be careful about giving any advice to teachers because it's a long time since I've done any teaching. I would say that if you're teaching a language, teaching English, you should inform yourself of how the language works. It's interesting anyway, and even if you're not explicitly using that, you should be aware of it. Not just your language, but the language of the people that you're teaching. Even if you don't speak the language, don't get very far with learning it, you can still learn about it. But don't get obsessed about it, and don't feel that your students have to learn grammar because they're not there to learn grammar. Grammar's a part of the language, they're learning the language. You don't learn grammar as a separate thing. So I think the focus in teaching and learning should be most of the time somewhere else. Occasionally you can focus on grammar, but generally speaking you should be focusing on other things. I also think it's important to realise how grammar and language generally really is learned. You can't really talk about grammar being learned, it's language. I mean, you can't have grammar without words or words without grammar. To be aware of the way in which it's learned and the variety of ways. Because you're dealing with people, if you're dealing with adults particularly, they're very, very different from each other and people learn in different ways and different speeds. It's important to be aware that learning a language is a bit like learning to drive, or learning to do anything like that, learning to dance, learning to play a sport. People learn at different speeds and learning happens in different ways. The brain acquires things almost when you're not aware of it. You suddenly find you can drive one day, the day before you couldn't. It's just when things come together. And grammar comes together in the same way. So you might teach a lesson on using this tense or something and don't expect it to work immediately. It's going to be a while. That's just one little bit of input, and hopefully there'll be lots of other bits of input, and then things come together quite sort of miraculously, really, and differently for different people.